wide on a mountain valley in Montana Territory. Winter, pines black against a white sky and one thin road climbing through them toward a cabin where smoke rises at the wrong hour. Closer now, the porch, a door that opens before anyone knocks, and a woman standing in it with her chin held level, the way a woman stands when she has already decided not to fall. Close on her hands. They are steady. They should not be steady. Not today. Because down in the town below, a coach has just pulled in, and a man in a fine gray coat is walking toward the platform with a folded paper in his fist and a cruelty he has rehearsed. And he does not yet know what waits up that road. He thinks he is bringing the end of her story. A wagon rolls in from the pines. 3 brothers. One of them steps down, and the snow, they say, forgets nothing. Picture a woman on the steps of a courthouse, Montana Territory, the first hard cold of winter, the year 1879. She is 25 years old. She is holding a worn leather folder against her chest, the way you hold the last thing in the world that still belongs to you, and the whole town has come out into the cold to watch what becomes of her. There is a man in a fine gray coat with a fistful of papers, and his voice carries the way cruelty likes to carry. There is a tall man beside her in a carpenter's coat, calm as still water, pressing a thick fold of money into the gray man's hand. And there is a federal marshal standing close, watching it all with the patience of a man who has finally arrived in time. The tall man says 6 words that the whole street hears. It does not buy her. Hear me. It frees her. And then the picture stops, right there. Because to understand how a quiet man on a mountain came to empty 2 years of his life onto the open street for a woman the town had already thrown away, you have to go back. All the way back. To a Wednesday in the fall. To a railhead. To the moment she stepped down with one bag and nowhere on this earth to go. If you are new here, settle in by the fire with me tonight and tell me in the comments which state you are listening from. Now, let me tell you about Marin Ashby. She came in on the afternoon coach from the railhead, 2:30. She was the last one to step down, and she stepped down careful, because the dress had been pressed clean before the journey and had not survived the journey, and a woman holds on to whatever is left. One bag. A spine she had decided in advance not to bend. A chin held level in the way of a woman who has already promised herself she will not weep in front of strangers. She was an orphan. She wants you to know that plainly, because she never hid from it. 3 years she had stayed on at the home where she was raised, taking in mending, stitching other people's torn lives back together for pennies, saving what pennies were left. $11. That was the sum of her saving after 3 years of needles and lamplight. $11. And when the advertisement came through, the home passed hand to hand. Among the women she read it twice. A man in the West. A good man, it said. A house and a future and a name to share. She had no name worth sharing and no house at all, so she read it a 3rd time. Then she signed. Then she spent every last one of those $11 on the fare. Because hope is the most expensive thing a poor woman ever buys. The platform was loud. The town pressed in around it all, dust and boards and the smell of horses and the smell of something frying somewhere. She set her bag down at her feet. She looked for the face she had been promised, the face from the letters, the man named Hollis Mercer, who had written to her in a careful hand about a quiet life and a porch and a future. She did not find him at first. She found something else. She found a woman. The woman was standing in the doorway of a tall, narrow building across the way, a boarding house with a painted sign, and she was scrubbing the steps on her knees in the cold. Young, thin, in the way that is not natural, and when she looked up and caught Marin's eye, she did not smile. She looked at the bag. She looked at the pressed and ruined dress. She looked at the hope on Marin's face, like a person looking at a thing she used to own. A man came out behind her, big, soft in the middle, and hard in the eyes. He set a hand on the thin woman's shoulder, not gentle, and he said something low, and the woman bent her head and went back to scrubbing. Marin did not know it yet, but she had just looked at her own future. She had just looked at Effie. Effie had answered an advertisement too, a year before. A good man in the West, a house, a future. Effie had come all this way, and the man had never come for her. And somehow, by a sleight of hand, she could never quite trace, she had ended up owing the man with the soft middle and the hard eyes for her passage. And her board. $40 to start. 40 that grew every single month, no matter how many steps she scrubbed. The man with the hard eyes had a name. Everyone in Cold Hollow knew it. Harlan Thorne. He owned the boarding house. He owned the bank. He owned, it was said, most of the valley, and he was working hard and quiet to own the rest. And he was standing now on the steps of his own bank across from the platform, watching the coach unload with a stack of papers under his arm and an expression like a man taking inventory. Watching her. Marin did not see him watching. She was still looking for the kind face from the letters, and then she found him. Hollis Mercer came along the boards with no kindness in him at all. He was the man from the letters, and he was nothing like the letters. He had a gray coat and an oiled mustache, and the loose, easy walk of a man who has never once in his life been left standing anywhere. He stopped in front of her. He looked her over, the way you look over a horse you have decided not to buy. "You're the Ashby woman," he said. "Yes," she said, "I am. And here is where it began. Here is where the whole street went quiet without meaning to, the way a street does when it senses something coming." He took out a folded paper. He held it up. He did not lower his voice. He raised it. "There has been a change of arrangement," he said. She did not understand. Not at first, because nothing in $11 and 3 years of saving had prepared her to understand a sentence like that on a public platform. "A change," she said, "of arrangement. I can't go through with it," he said. Loud enough for the woman by the dry goods to stop walking. Loud enough for 2 men outside the feed store to turn. Loud enough that by supper half the town would know, and by morning the other half, because that was the whole of the cruelty. He did it where it would land hardest. She stood. She let him finish. Her hands stayed at her sides, and her face did the work she needed it to do, which was nothing, which was stillness. "You wrote to me," she said. The words were quiet, and they were steady. "You wrote to me for 8 months. He waved the paper, as if a paper could answer that. "I used a word then. He said the agreement was his to break. He held that paper up like a deed, like a thing that proved ownership, and every soul on that platform knew exactly what a paper was and was not. Because a woman is not land. A woman cannot be claimed like a strip of dirt." Everyone knew it, but Hollis Mercer held the paper like a man who wanted the weight of paper behind him, because he did not have the weight of anything else. And then he put it back in his coat, and he turned, and he walked away, without once looking back. The platform cleared around her the way water clears around a stone. People remembered somewhere else they needed to be. The thin woman across the way had stopped scrubbing and was watching with her whole still face, and on the bank steps, Harlan Thorne watched too, and made a small note of something and went inside. And Marin Ashby stood alone with her bag at her feet, and the whole wide town spread out in front of her, and no answer at all to the only question that mattered. What now? She did not cry. I want you to mark that. She had decided on the train not to cry, and she kept the promise, even now, even when keeping it cost everything. She picked up her bag. She did not know where she would carry it. But she picked it up because a woman has to do something with her hands, and a bag is something. Her thoughts were not calm. Inside, where no one could see, the thoughts were not calm at all. $11. That was. No. Stop. Think. There is the church, maybe. Maybe the church. Except they will have heard by morning. They will all have heard. And a woman with no name and no money, and a story like this one. No. The home. Could she write to the home? With what? With what coin? There was no coin. There was no fare back. There was no back. There was only this street and these boards and the cold coming down off the mountains, and she did not even know the name of the mountains. That was the state of her. Outside, a straight back and a level chin. Inside, a woman doing arithmetic with numbers that would not add up no matter how she moved them. What kind of man, I want you to ask yourself, walks across a street for a stranger like that? With the whole town watching, with nothing in it for him, because one did. Across the way, the door of the hardware store opened, and 3 men came out onto the boardwalk step. Mountain men. You would have known it at a glance. The kind of men the high country makes and then keeps. They had a wagon at the rail, half loaded with supplies, sacks of flour and a coil of new rope and a crate of iron fittings, and they had come down off their land for the things that land cannot grow. The tallest of them stopped on the step. He was a big man, broad in the shoulder, and his hands were a carpenter's hands, scarred across the knuckles and sure. There was sawdust still caught in the weave of his sleeve from a morning's work. He was 33 years old, and he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he had stopped noticing the weight of it. His name was Elias Hartwell. Beside him stood his brothers. Garrett, the middle one, 29. Restless, a man built for breaking horses and for trouble, in roughly equal measure with a grin. He used the way some men use a fist. And Levi, the youngest, 24, quiet, a stillness in him, standing with most of his weight on one leg because the other one had been broken badly once and had healed wrong, and a way of looking at the world like a man who reads tracks and reads people the same way. 3 brothers, 1 wagon, and a scene laid out in front of them on the open platform that any of them could read. The bag, the straight back, the pressed dress gone to ruin, the empty space where a man had just been. Garrett saw it, and his grin went somewhere else. Levi saw it and went very still. And Elias saw it, and something moved behind his face that he set down again before it could become anything. I had a wife once. I will tell you that now, because it matters. He had a wife named Lenore, and she had been gone 2 winters, and there was a particular look that came over Elias Hartwell when he saw a woman standing alone with nowhere to go, and it was not pity. Pity is cheap. It was recognition. Stay with the wagon, he said to his brothers. And then he crossed the street. He came up to the bottom of the platform steps, and he stopped there, and he looked up at her, and he took the hat off his head. Which is a small thing, except it is not a small thing. Not from a man like that to a woman who has just been told in public that she is no one. Marin looked down at him. She measured him the way you measure a stranger when measuring strangers is the only skill standing between you and the cold. Elias Hartwell, he said. That was all. His name, as if a name were a thing he could hand her. She did not answer. She was waiting to learn what a man like this wanted, because she had just finished learning in front of the whole town exactly what a man could want. I've got 2 children, he said, and a house that needs keeping. I do carpentry work 3 days a week, mornings mostly, so you'd have the place to yourself. She held his eyes. She did not move. It's temporary, he said. Room and board, until you've sorted what comes next. The wind came up off the hills between them, clean and cold. The town pretended not to watch and watched, and then he asked her the question. The one I told you to remember. Can you cook? He said. It was not a cruel question. It was not Hollis Mercer's question. There was no scorn in it. It was just a plain man asking a plain thing, because a plain thing was all he had to offer. And he was not going to pretend it was finer than it was. She met his eyes, and she answered. I can, she said, and I'm not afraid of hard work. Something in him eased. You would have had to be watching close to catch it. The set of his shoulders, the breath he let go. Then let's go, she said. She picked up her bag. She came down the steps, and she walked off that platform beside a man she had known for the length of one cold conversation, and behind her the whole town, stored it up for later, every word of it to chew over by their own fires that night. As they reached the wagon, a man near the feed store said it low to another, not low enough. That's the Hartwell place taking her on, the one that lost his wife, Lenore, 2 winters back. And the other man said low and easy the way men pass a thing they have not thought hard about. They called it an accident. Marin did not understand the words. Not then. She did not know yet that those 4 words were the loose thread of the whole thing, and that she would be the one to pull it. She only saw Elias Hartwell's jaw tighten as he lifted her bag into the wagon bed. Just once. Just for a moment. And then it was gone, set down again like everything else he set down. And up on the bank steps, Harlan Thorne stood in the doorway with his stack of papers, and he watched the Hartwell wagon take on a woman, and he did not make a note this time. He simply watched. The way a man watches a board he had planned to move when another player puts a piece where he did not expect it. What was Harlan Thorne planning, you might ask? What did a man who owned a valley want with a woman left standing on a platform? Hold that. We'll come back to it. We'll come back to it sooner than anyone in that wagon would have liked. The road up to the Hartwell place climbed. It climbed out of the town and along a creek and up into the pines, and the higher it went, the quieter the world got, until the only sounds were the wagon and the creak of harness and the wind moving through trees so tall they made a dusk of their own at midday. Marin sat on the seat between Elias and the rail. The brothers rode behind in the bed among the flour and the rope. No one talked much. Garrett tried once some joke about the road, and it landed in the quiet and lay there, and he let it. Levi watched the tree line the whole way, like a man expecting the tree line to say something. She watched the country open and close around her. She had never seen mountains like these. She had never seen a place that did not care whether she lived or died, and somehow found it easier than the platform, easier than the town, easier than a man with a paper in his hand. The mountains were honest. The mountains did not pretend to be kind. What had she done, she thought? What in the name of sense had she done? She had gotten into a stranger's wagon. Because of course she had. Because the alternative was the cold in the church and the story already racing ahead of her into every parlor in Cold Hollow. So a stranger's wagon, with three of them. Three strange men and a road going up into nowhere, and no one on this earth who knew where she was or would ask after her if she never came down. And then she looked at the tall one beside her, at the hands on the reins, at the hat he had put back on, and she thought against all her arithmetic that a man who takes his hat off on a public step is not the same as a man who waves a paper. She did not know that for certain. She had been wrong before. She had been wrong about Hollis Mercer for 8 months of letters, but she chose for the length of that road to be a little less afraid. And being a little less afraid was its own kind of work. The place sat at the high edge of a meadow where the pines pulled back. A cabin, larger than she expected, well built by a man who knew how to build. A barn, a side pen with 2 horses in it that came to the rail when they heard the wagon. A workshop off the cabin with a wide door, and through the door she could see the shapes of a man's trade, a long workbench tool hung in their places, the pale gold of fresh-cut wood, the smell of it reaching her even on the seat, and a porch with a step that sagged. 1 step second from the top, gone soft and loose, the kind of thing a busy man means to fix and never does. She noticed it. She said nothing. Inside the front room was clean in the particular way of a house run by men with no woman in it. Functional, orderly, nothing soft anywhere. A stove doing its steady work in the corner, a table scrubbed pale, shelves with a few books and fewer ornaments. And on the shelf above the kitchen window where the late light came in, there sat a small sewing basket with a wooden lid. She saw it the moment she came in. A woman who has spent 3 years with a needle sees a sewing basket the way a sailor sees the sea. And this one had the look of a thing no one had touched in a long time. Dust along the lid in a thin, even line. Placed high and placed careful. Something everyone in this house had quietly agreed to leave alone. She did not ask about it. You do not have to be told a thing is grief to know it is grief. Elias set her bag inside the door of a small room off the kitchen. This is yours, he said. Your own door, your own space. Children eat at 6. I eat when I'm back. And that was the arrangement, as plain as the question on the platform. Then she met them. The boy came first from the back of the house, with the timing of a child who has been listening from somewhere. He is not supposed to be. 10 years old, his father's build already starting in the shoulders. A face that kept its own counsel, that gave away nothing that had learned early not to. His name was Jasper. He looked at Marin, the way a person looks at a thing they have seen a version of before and are not ready to feel anything new about. He had seen women come to keep this house. He had seen them go. He looked at his father, and he looked at her, and he turned around and walked back the way he came, without a single word. Which said plenty. The girl did not arrive, so much as appear 6 years old, 1 ribbon tied properly and 1 simply hanging loose, the way ribbons go on a child. No one has had the patience to fix that morning. She stood at the edge of the room and she looked at Marin with the whole of her face, with that open and unguarded attention of a child who has not yet learned to want things quietly. Her name was Hattie, Maren looked back at her. Steady. Even. Nothing performed. Are you hungry? Maren said. Hattie considered this with great seriousness, the way 6-year-olds consider everything. A little bit, she said. Come help me, Maren said. Let's see what's in the larder. And Hattie came. Without hesitation, she crossed that whole room and put her small hand up to hold the edge of Maren's skirt, and she came. Behind them from a doorway, Jasper watched it happen. And his jaw, that small, hard 10-year-old jaw, set the way his father's set. As if he had decided something. As if he had seen a woman win his sister over before and knew exactly how that ended. Supper that first night was beans and cornbread and a broth. Now, the larder held almost nothing. A poor man's larder, the larder of men, who eat to keep working and do not think much about it. Beans and a little salt pork and onions going soft and a heel of yesterday's bread. Maren stood in front of it and did the only thing she knew how to do well, which was to make something out of nearly nothing, because a woman who saves $11 over 3 years has spent her whole life making something out of nearly nothing, and the smell of it reached the front room before anyone sat down. It was a broth that had no business smelling the way it smelled, given what had gone into it. Onion and salt pork and patience and something she did with the bones that her own mother might have known if she had ever had a mother, which she had not, but the knowing came from somewhere all the same. Elias came in from the yard and stopped just inside the door. Something moved across his face, that same thing from the platform there, and then gone set down. He did not say anything about the smell, but he stopped. They sat. The brothers came in. Garrett ate like a man who has not eaten well in a while and is suspicious of his good luck. Levi ate quietly, watching. Jasper ate with his eyes on his bowl and nowhere else. And Hattie ate, with her eyes going back and forth in a steady rotation. Bowl, Maren, bowl, Maren, as if checking that the woman was still there. Partway through, Hattie set down her spoon, and she announced with the terrible honesty of the young the thing she had been holding. The last lady who kept house for us burned everything she touched. Elias said her name, Hattie, a low warning that was not really a warning. But Hattie looked at Maren instead of at her father, and she finished it. She did. She burned the beans every time. And Maren, eyes on her plate, said the thing that turned the whole table. Burnt beans are a serious matter, she said. I don't take them lightly. There was a silence, and then from the end of the table, Jasper looked up, just for a moment, and the corner of his mouth moved. Once, the smallest crack in the smallest wall, and then it returned to where it had been, and he said nothing more. But when supper was done, he stayed at the table a little longer than he needed to, before he went to bed. A few minutes, whittling at nothing with a small knife. Present in a house where he had decided in advance not to be present, and Elias noted that. Without comment, the way he noted everything. The first days found their shape slowly. Elias rose before the light and went out to the cold and came back in, and on the second morning he stopped on the porch step. The loose one. He pressed it with his boot. He pressed it again. He stood there a moment in the dark and the cold, thinking. And then he went inside, and he poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot, and he set one on the counter near where Maren was already working, already up already at the stove. He said nothing about it, nothing about the step. He did not say, drink this. He just left it there, the steam coming off it in the cold kitchen, and went to his work. And she said nothing about it either. She drank it. They drank their coffee in the early quiet, with the dark pressing on the window and the cold settling in around the house, and neither one of them named the thing that was happening, because neither one of them was sure yet that anything was happening at all. Later that day, while Elias was gone to a job down the valley, Maren heard hammering on the porch. It was Levi, the youngest, down on one knee, his bad leg out straight to the side, fitting a new board where the soft step had been. He worked slow and careful and sure, and when he caught her watching from the doorway, he did not stop, and he did not explain. Eli said it needed doing, was all he said. Eli. So that was what they called him in the family. Eli. She brought Levi a cup of the coffee, too, and he took it with a nod, and that was the whole of the conversation. And somehow, it was a great deal. Here is a thing about Maren Ashby that the town did not know and would not have believed. She could read. Not just read. She could read a column of figures and tell you in a moment where it lied to you. The home where she was raised had taught her letters because a woman who can read can be sent out as a governess, and they had taught her sums because a woman who can keep accounts can be hired by a shop. And Maren had taken to both, the way some people take to music. She found it out about herself again on the third evening when Jasper was at the table fighting with a slate and a primer, scowling at his letters as if the letters had wronged him. "That one's a G," she said quietly, not looking up from her mending. "The tail goes under the line, like a hook." Jasper froze. He had not asked. He did not look at her. But after a moment, slowly, he made the tail go under the line, like a hook. She did not praise him. She had learned somewhere that a boy like that does not want praise. That praise to a boy like that is a hand reaching for him, and a boy like that has decided not to be reached for. So she said nothing. She just kept mending, and he just kept working. And the lamp burned down between them, the two most guarded people in that house sitting in the same small circle of light. She also kept finding the household accounts, not snooping. They were simply there, a ledger of feed and seed and supplies and the slow, patient sums of a family, rebuilding from very little. And her eye ran down the columns the way it always ran, automatic, and she saw a family that had almost nothing and was being careful with the nothing it had. And she saw something else too, near the back, a set of figures she did not understand, large ones set aside untouched, and she closed the book, because it was not hers to read. But the number stayed with her, because numbers always stayed with her. The bad expectation kept failing. That is the thing I want you to feel about those first days. Maren had come up that mountain braced for the worst, because the worst was all the world had shown her. She had braced those first nights lying awake in the small room off the kitchen with her own door that locked for a hand on the latch that never came. She had braced for cruelty and got coffee on the counter. She had braced for a savage place and found a clean one full of careful work and quiet children and a man who took his hat off. She had braced to be used and instead found herself slowly being trusted. And the strange thing, the thing she could not have explained to anyone, was that the trust frightened her more than the cruelty would have. Because she knew what to do with cruelty. She had a whole life of knowing. She did not know what to do with a cup of coffee left for her in the cold. So she worked. She made the larder stretch. She fixed Hattie's ribbons every morning, both of them tied proper. She read to the girl in the evenings from the few books on the shelf, doing the voices without embarrassment, and Hattie pressed against her side with the complete and final trust of a child who has made a decision and sees no reason to revisit it. And Jasper sat at the far end of the room with something in his hands, and he did not look up, and he did not leave. That was the shape of it. That was the small, fragile shape the days were making. A house with the cold held off. A woman braced for a blow that kept not coming. She should have known. A blow that keeps not coming is only a blow that has not come yet. It came on a gray morning at the end of the first week. She heard the horses before she saw them, more than one, coming up the road fast, which nothing on this mountain ever did because the road did not allow for fast. She was at the window with a dish rag in her hands and Hattie at her feet, and she looked out and her stomach turned over because she knew the gray coat coming up through the pines. Hollis Mercer. And he was not alone. 3 riders behind him. Hard men. Thorn's men, though she did not have the name for them yet. And they came into the yard and did not get down. And the horses stamped and blew steam in the cold, and Hollis Mercer sat his horse in the middle of the Hartwell yard and looked at the cabin like a man come to collect a debt. Elias came out of the workshop. He had a chisel still in his hand, and he set it down on the bench inside the door, without hurry. And he came out into the yard, and he did not say anything. He just stood. And from the barn, Garrett came, and from the tree line, where he had been splitting wood, came Levi with the axe still in his hand, and the 3 brothers spread out across that yard without a word between them, the way men do when they have stood together before. Hollis Mercer held up a paper. The fee was paid, he said. The arrangement was made. And an obligation doesn't dissolve just because a woman finds herself somewhere more comfortable to sleep. He looked at the cabin when he said it. At the window. At her. Maren had come to the door. She did not step out. But she did not step back either. She stood in the doorway with Hattie's small hand gripping her skirt, and she held herself the way she had held herself on the platform, straight, level, not finished. "Get off my land," Elias said. It was the first thing he said, and it was very quiet. But Hollis Mercer was not finished. And here is the thing he said that turned that gray morning into something else entirely. The thing that opened the door on everything that was coming. "You don't understand what you've taken in Hartwell," he said, and he smiled when he said it. "You think this is some poor jilted bride you've done a kindness to. You think you crossed a street and saved somebody." He leaned down over his saddle horn. "She was never going to be my wife," he said. "There was never any wife in it. Mr. Thorne sends for them. From the east. Girls with nobody. Girls nobody will come looking for. He pays the fare and he writes the sweet letters and he gets them all the way out here. And then the marriage falls through, doesn't it? Always does. And by then, they owe him. The fare, the board, the interest, and a girl who owes Harlan Thorne works it off anyway Harlan Thorne sees fit." Maren felt the floor of the world tilt under her. The letters. 8 months of letters in a careful hand about a porch and a future. Not a man's heart at all. A trap. A baited line with her on the end of it. She had spent her last $11 and 3 years of saving to put the hook in her own mouth. Effie, she thought. The thin woman scrubbing the steps. $40 that grew every month. That was not bad luck. That was the plan. That was always the plan. She was a thing Harlan Thorne had ordered, and she had been delivered to the wrong house. "That's what you've got under your roof," Hollis Mercer said, leaning back, satisfied. "Mr. Thorne's property, and Mr. Thorne would like it returned. He's a reasonable man. He'll even forgive the trouble. But this is a paper matter now. Hartwell and paper has the law behind it, and you are a small man on a small mountain. So we'll be back with the law, and you'll hand her over, or you'll learn what it costs to keep what isn't yours." He sat there a moment, letting it land. Garrett took a step. Just one. And the grin was gone from his face, and something much worse had replaced it, and Levi shifted his grip on the axe, and the three hard men behind Mercer went still and watchful. But it was Elias who spoke, and he did not move at all. "You said law," Elias said. He said it slow, as if turning the word over. "You bring law up this mountain," he said. "Real law, not Thorne's sheriff. Real law. And we'll all stand in front of it together. You and her and me and Thorne. And we'll see whose paper holds." It was not a threat. It was something stranger and colder than a threat. It was an invitation, and for just a moment just one something flickered across Hollis Mercer's face that did not match his smile. Because a man running a baited line does not as a rule want to stand in front of real law and explain his bait. He covered it fast. He pulled his horse around. "Have her ready," he said, and he rode out the three hard men falling in behind him, gone through the pines and gone in the cold morning, closed over the sound of the horses. And then there was only the yard and the steam still hanging where the horses had been, and a woman in the doorway who had just learned that her whole journey west had been someone else's plan. For a long moment nobody spoke. Maren looked down at Hattie's hand, fisted in her skirt. She looked up at the three brothers standing in the cold. She looked at Elias, who had turned now to look at her, the chisel forgotten, his face holding everything behind it, the way it always did. "I didn't know," she said. It came out of her in pieces. Her voice, that steady voice she had kept level through the whole platform, through the whole journey, broke just slightly at the edges, and now just slightly, and she hated it. "The letters. I thought there was a man, Hollis. I thought he was. I gave my last. I spent everything to come to a man who was never. Didn't know I was. I didn't know I belonged to." "Stop," Elias said. Just the one word, the same word he had given her on the platform. "Stop. You don't belong to anybody," he said. "Not him. Not Thorne. Hear me. Paper or no paper. A person is not a thing that gets ordered and returned. There's no law on this earth, real or crooked, that makes a woman into property. And anybody who says different is going to have to come through this yard to prove it." And Garrett beside him, still cold, still nothing like his grin, said the truest thing anyone had said all morning. "Let them bring the law," he said. "I'd like to hear Harlan Thorne explain himself to a real judge." But Levi did not say anything. Levi was looking down the empty road where the riders had gone, and there was something working behind his quiet face, and after a moment he said low, almost to himself, "Thorne doesn't bluff. If he wants this place, he's wanted things before." And he stopped. He did not finish it. And Maren saw Elias look at his youngest brother sharply, and she saw Garrett go very still, and she understood without being told that she had walked into the middle of a story that started long before her coach pulled into Cold Hollow. That this was not only about her, that Harlan Thorne wanting the Hartwell land was not new, that something had happened here once, something nobody in this yard would say out loud. "Lenore. 2 winters back, they called it an accident." The words from the platform came back to her, and for the first time she heard the shape of them, and the shape was wrong, and the wrongness sat down in her chest and would not get up. She did not ask. Not yet. You do not, on the worst morning of someone's grief, reach up and open the basket they have placed so carefully on the highest shelf. But she filed it away. Because she filed everything away. Because a woman who can read a column of figures and find the lie in it does not stop reading just because the figures turn into people. That night the house was very quiet. The children slept. The brothers had talked low at the table after supper, and then gone, Garrett to the barn, Levi to the small room he kept off the workshop, and Marin sat by the dying stove with her hands still for once not working, and she thought. She thought about the $11. She thought about Effie on the steps. She thought about a held up in the cold, like a deed. She thought about how easy it would be, how much safer to slip away in the dark, to take what little she had and go before the law that was not law came back up the mountain before she brought ruin down on a family that had done nothing but feed her and trust her and fix a step. Go where the panicked voice in her said. Go where with what? There's no fair, there's no back, there's no. And under the panic, lower, steadier, another voice. Her own, the one that had kept her chin level on the platform. You have nowhere to go, it said. But for the first time in your life, you have somewhere you do not want to leave. She heard a sound and looked up. Elias was in the doorway from the yard. He had been out checking the horses, checking the dark, a man who would now be checking the dark for a long time because of her. He stood there with his hand on the doorframe and the cold coming in around him, and he looked at her by the dying light of the stove, and there was a question in his face that he was too plain a man to dress up. You all right? He said. She thought about it. Honestly, she owed him at least an honest answer. I'm afraid, she said. Not for me. I've been afraid for me my whole life. I'm used to it. I'm afraid for them, for the children, for you and your brothers, because of what I've brought up your mountain. He was quiet a moment. You didn't bring it, he said. It was already here. He didn't say what it was. It was here before you. You just gave it a reason to come out in the open. And maybe. He stopped. And maybe that's not the worst thing. She looked at him. You could ask me to go, she said. It would be safer. I'd understand it. And Elias Hartwell, a man who said as little as any man she had ever met, said the thing that decided her, the thing that decided everything. I don't keep a thing, he said, by being scared of what comes for it. He nodded once. Good night, he said, and he went to his room, and the house settled into its dark and its cold and its quiet. And Marin Ashby did not pack her bag. She sat a while longer by the stove. And then she rose, and she banked the coals the way she did every night now. Careful, so there would be warmth in the morning for the children, and for the man, and for the two strange, gentle brothers. And she went to her own room with her own door. But before she did, she stood a moment in front of the kitchen window, and she looked up at the highest shelf, at the sewing basket with the wooden lid and the thin, even line of dust, the thing no one touched, the thing that held, though she did not know it yet, the answer to 4 words spoken on a platform by a man who did not even know he was telling her the truth. They called it an accident. She looked at it for a long moment, and something in her, the part that found the lie in the figures, the part that had survived everything, by paying attention, leaned toward that basket, the way a needle leans toward true north. Not tonight. She would not touch it tonight. But she was going to stay. She had decided, and a woman who decides to stay in a house with a secret on the high shelf is a woman who is sooner or later going to find out what the secret is. The question was whether she would find it before Harlan Thorne came back, with his hard men and his crooked law, and the thing he had done once already on this mountain that nobody here would name. Because he was coming back. He had said so. And Harlan Thorne, as the youngest brother had said into the cold with such quiet certainty, did not bluff. So the fire burned low in the Hartwell cabin that night, and a woman the whole town had thrown away lay awake in a small room with her own door, no longer planning her escape, planning instead for the first time in her life to fight for something. And up the dark valley in a fine house, in a town that already knew her shame by heart, a man with a stack of papers was planning too. What had happened to Lenore Hartwell 2 winters back on this very mountain? And what did Harlan already know about it? That a careful woman with a good eye for a lie was about to start to learn. The frost came to the mountain, and it came to stay. It silvered the meadow grass before dawn, and did not melt by noon. The pines went dark and still, and the world up at the Hartwell place pulled in close around the warmth of the cabin, the way a cold hand closes around a coal. And in that closing in something was happening. Slow, quiet, the way the things that matter most always seem to happen when nobody is looking straight at them. Maren Ashby was no longer a guest in that house. She had stopped being a guest somewhere in the second week, and nobody had announced it, least of all her. It was simply true. The larder that had held almost nothing now held a little more, because she stretched every dollar Elias left on the counter until it begged for mercy. The cabin smelled of bread on the days she baked. The children's clothes were mended every tear, and Hattie's 2 ribbons were tied proper every single morning, both of them before the girl was even fully awake. She was learning the country too. Garrett taught her to load a rifle. He did it the way Garrett did everything, with a grin and too many words, and she did it the way she did everything, silent and careful, and getting it right on the 3rd try. He told her she had a steady hand. She told him a woman who threads a needle by lamplight for 3 years has a steadier hand than any man who breaks horses. He laughed at that, loud. It was the first time she had made any of them laugh on purpose. And Levi taught her to read the ground. That was the strange one. The youngest brother. He moved slow on the bad leg, and he spoke slower than that, but out along the tree line he showed her things she had never thought to see. A track was a sentence, he told her. A man's weight here, a pause there. A thing he was carrying on the right side. See how the right print sinks deeper. The ground keeps a record. People think the snow forgets. The snow forgets nothing. She did not know yet why a man would learn the ground that well. She did not know what Levi Hartwell had read out of the snow one morning, 2 winters back, and had never once spoken aloud. But she remembered it. The way she remembered everything that did not add up. Maren had stopped waiting for the bottom to fall out. That was the change in her. Somewhere in those weeks she had let herself begin to believe the warmth was real. And believing it frightened her more than any cruelty ever had. Because belief was the one thing she had never had any practice keeping. So she did what frightened people do, who are also brave. She kept her hands busy, and she kept her eyes open. It was the ledger that started it. She had seen it that first week. The household accounts, the patient, careful sums of a family rebuilding from very little, and her eye had run down the columns the way it always ran, and snagged, near the back, a set of figures that did not belong, large ones, land figures, acres and prices, and a name that appeared again and again in the margin. Thorn. She told herself it was none of her business. She told herself that for 2 weeks. And then, one evening, with the children abed, and the brothers gone to the barn, and Elias down the valley on a job, she took the ledger down. And she read it the way she had been born to read it. And the figures lied. Not the family's figures. Those were honest to the penny. The other ones. The land figures in the margins, the prices Thorne had paid for one valley parcel after another over 6 years. They were too low, wildly too low. A man does not buy good creek bottom for the price of scrub, unless the seller has no choice, unless the deed was already in question before the sale, unless somebody had arranged for the land to be worth nothing to its owner, so it could be worth everything to Harlan Thorne. She sat there a long time with the lamp burning down, because this was not Elias's handwriting in the margins. It was finer, a woman's hand, careful, and even the hand of someone who had been keeping a quiet record of her own. Lenore. What had Lenore Hartwell been writing down 2 winters ago in the back of the family ledger? And why did the figures she wrote down look exactly like the figures of a crime? She closed the book. She put it back. She did not sleep much that night. She went into town. 3 days later, she had to. The flour was nearly gone, and Elias was finishing a barn raising down the valley, and would not be back before dark, and Levi drove her down in the wagon, and she felt the eyes the moment the wagon rolled onto the main street. She had known she would. A woman does not get left on a public platform and then disappear up a mountain without the whole town keeping the story warm. They looked at her from doorways. They looked and looked away. And across the street on the steps of the boarding house, a thin woman with a scrub brush looked up and held Marin's eye for one long moment before a hand came down on her shoulder and turned her back to her work. Effie. Still scrubbing, still owing, still the future Marin had so narrowly missed. Marin made herself look away. She was at the counter of the general store, counting coins, when the woman came to stand beside her. She was a handsome woman of 50 in good wool, with the warm and practiced manner of someone delivering concern she had prepared at home. The wife of the man who kept Thorne's books, Hester Vance. Marin did not know the name yet. She would soon. "You're the Ashby girl," Hester said. "Sweet, like sugar over a blade." "I am," Marin said. "I do hope you're settling," Hester said. "People worry about a situation like yours, about what it looks like." "What does it look like?" Marin said. She did not stop counting her coins. "Well, a young woman, alone, up there with all those men," Hester said, "and those poor motherless children given the wrong idea about what an arrangement is. Children get confused. They start to think a thing is permanent, when it never was." She let that sit. "It's only kindness," Hester said, "to tell you what's being said, before you find yourself somewhere you can't easily come back from." Marin set her last coin on the counter, one at a time. She turned, and she looked at Hester Vance with a calm that had been forged in rooms exactly like this one by women exactly like this one more times than Hester could imagine. "I was raised in a charity home," Marin said. Quiet, even. "I have been measured by women with prepared voices my whole life. So I'll tell you what I learned. Another person's measure of me is not the truth. It's just the measure they need me to be." And she picked up her flower, and she walked out. But here is what Marin did not see. As she climbed back onto the wagon, Hester Vance crossed the street, to the bank, and went inside. To a man behind a desk with a stack of papers who listened to every word and set down his pen and said nothing at all. The net was tightening, and the woman in it was only beginning to understand. There was a net at all. It was the land office letter that broke it open. She found it cleaning. She was not snooping. I want you to know that, because Marin wanted it known. She was turning out a chest in the front room, the kind of chest a family fills and forgets, and beneath the spare quilts and a child's outgrown coat, there was a packet of papers tied in string, and one of them was a letter, begun, never sent. A rough draft crossed out and written over in places in the same fine, careful hand from the ledger. It was addressed to the Territorial Land Office in Helena, and it asked a question. It asked, in the polite, measured language of a woman who knows she is treading somewhere dangerous, whether the federal patents recorded on certain valley parcels were genuine. Because the letter said she had reason to believe that the seals on the deeds Mr. Harlan Thorne was using to perfect his claims did not match the seals issued by the proper federal authority. She had seen a true one. She had seen his. They were not the same. The letter stopped in the middle of a sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted, as if she had meant to finish it later. There was no later. Marin sat back on her heels with the letter in her two hands and the cold truth settling into her chest like the cold settling into the house. Lenore Hartwell had been about to expose Harlan Thorne. She had figured out that the whole valley he was buying up, he was buying with forged paper. She had been going to write to Helena and bring real federal law down on him. And before she could finish the letter, she had died. They called it an accident. 4 words. Marin heard them now the way she had heard them on the platform, and the shape was wrong, and this time she knew exactly why. She did not say anything to Elias. Not yet. You do not on an ordinary evening put a thing like that in a grieving man's hands across the supper table. She put the letter back. She tied the string. She closed the chest, and she carried the knowledge alone, the way she carried everything, while the question burned in her like a low coal that would not go out. What did Lenore Hartwell know? And who on this mountain had needed her not to finish her letter? And then, before she could decide what to do with any of it, came the morning that changed the whole house. It was a gray, ordinary morning. Cold, unremarkable. Hattie was crossing the kitchen in her stocking feet, still warm from sleep, absorbed in some private 6-year-old business, and she caught her toe on the threshold between the kitchen and the hall, and she went down, hard, both palms slapping the floor. The sound she made was the startled kind, the kind that comes before a child has decided whether it warrants tears. She decided it did, and Marin was on the floor with her before the crying had fully started, down on her knees. Both small hands taken up in hers, turning the palms over, checking them, holding them warm and steady, not making a fuss, not going anywhere, and Hattie, with the whole easy honesty of a child who has stopped deciding and simply knows, said the word that was true. Mama. It went into that cabin and it did not leave. Marin's hands did not move. One breath. No more. The word sat in the air over the two of them, small and enormous, and a lesser woman would have flinched from it or wept on it or made it into more than a hurt child needed it to be. She did none of that. She gathered the girl in, and she held her until the crying ran itself out, calm and certain, giving no outward sign of what the word had done to the room. But the room had felt it, all of it, because Elias was in the bedroom doorway. He had heard. He stood with one hand flat on the frame, and he looked at the hallway floor, at the woman on her knees holding his daughter. And something was moving in him, something large and slow and long held under, and he kept his eyes away from it, the way you keep your eyes away from a thing that will undo you if you look at it straight. And at the table, Jasper had gone still. 10 years old. He knew exactly what he had heard, and exactly what it meant. And something in that hard, small face that had been shut since before Marin ever climbed off the coach was working slow toward open. Nobody said a word about it. Elias went back into his room and sat on the edge of the bed with his hand on his knee, and he stayed there a long while as the morning moved quiet around the house. And when he came out, he poured 2 cups of coffee like every morning. But he stood beside her a moment longer than he ever had. Just a moment. And he did not say anything. And he did not need to. It should have been the safest morning that house had known. It was the last safe morning it would know for a long time. The trouble came from inside first. It usually does. It was Garrett. She found out about Garrett by accident, the way she found out everything with her eyes open and her hands busy. 2 men rode up one afternoon, not Mercer, not Thorne's hard men, just 2 ordinary men with hard errands, and they did not get down, and they spoke low to Garrett at the edge of the yard, and Garrett's face, that grinning, easy face, went gray. And he said something fast and low, and they rode off, and he stood there a long moment looking at nothing. She did not pry, but that night the brothers fought. She heard it from her room, low and fierce, the way men fight who love each other and are terrified. Elias's voice level and hard, and Garrett's breaking. How much, Elias said. It doesn't matter how much. How much, Garrett? A silence. And then a number, and the number was bad. The number was very bad. You. Away, Harlan Thorne. Elias's voice was very quiet. The man trying to take everything out from under us. You sat at his table. You played his cards. And now you owe him. I didn't know it would. Garrett's voice cracked. I thought I could win it back. I always thought I could win it back. That's how he does it. Eli, that's how he gets a man. He lets you win just enough. What does he want? Another silence. The worst kind. "I wants the place," Garrett said. "Or he wants her gone." He said if I help move her along, if I help you see sense about the land, he'll call the debt square. He smiled when he said it, Eli, like it was a favor. There was no sound for a moment in that house but the cold ticking in the stove, and Marin stood in her small room, with her hand over her mouth, because now she understood. This was the shape of Harlan Thorne. He did not come at a man head-on. He got inside first. He found the loose board in a family, and he worked it loose. Effie's debt, Garrett's debt, the whole valley bought low. He found what a person owed, and he turned it into a chain. She did not sleep. She lay awake, and she thought the panicked voice and the steady voice, taking turns the way they always did. Leave. You should leave. You are the price. Get out of this house and the debt goes square, and the children keep their home. Except the children. Except Hattie, said Mama. Except a girl who has nowhere to go has, for the first time in her life, somewhere she cannot make herself leave. And under all of it, lower, steadier than either voice, a new thing, not fear, anger. Because she had found the letter. Because she knew what Lenore knew. Because the man squeezing this family with a card debt was the same man whose forged paper a dead woman had been about to expose. And a woman who can find the lie in a column of figures does not in the end run from the man who wrote the lie. She starts instead to think about how to make him answer for it. She did not get the chance to decide. Harlan Thorne decided for her. 3 nights later, It was past midnight when the horses screamed. Not the wind, the horses. That high, terrible sound a horse makes that no person who has heard it ever forgets. Maren came awake all at once, and she smelled it before she was even on her feet. Smoke. The barn was burning. She was out of her room and into the front of the cabin, and the window was orange, the whole window. The barn at the far side of the yard was a wall of fire, the dry hay and the old timber going up like a struck match, and the light of it threw the whole meadow into a hellish flickering day, and the heat of it reached across the yard and pressed against the glass. Elias was already moving, already out the door, shouting his brothers up, and Garrett came stumbling from the barn loft where he had taken to sleeping, and Levi came at a dead run on the bad leg from the workshop, and the three of them threw themselves at the fire, and the panicked horses, hauling the pen gate wide, driving the screaming animals out into the dark. And Maren stood in the doorway of the cabin with the children behind her and the fire in front of her and her whole body shaking, and she did the count. The way she counted everything. Elias, Garrett, Levi, the horses out running, and the children. Behind her, Hattie at her skirt, and Jasper. She turned. Hattie was there clutching, sobbing, and Jasper was not. Jasper. She heard her own voice come out of her ragged, a sound she had never made. The boy who slept hardest. The boy who had crept out night after night. She knew it. She had heard him to sleep in the loft of the barn near the horses. He loved more than he loved most people, because a guarded boy will give to an animal what he cannot yet give to a person. I was in the barn. She did not think. There was no thinking left. She put Hattie's hands into the door frame, and she said, "Stay," and she ran. Across the yard, into the heat, into the orange, roaring world, and she heard Elias shout her name behind her, heard the terror in it, and she did not stop. The barn doors were a wall of flame, but the low side, where the loft ladder was, the side was not yet gone. She went in low under the smoke, the way some old instinct told her, down where the air still was, and she screamed his name into the roar, and she heard him. A cough, high in the loft, trapped by the fire that had eaten the ladder. She could not reach him. The ladder was gone. The loft was 10 feet up, and the floor below it was beginning to burn. But Levi could. Levi, who came through the side door behind her on that bad leg. Levi, who had heard her run, and followed Levi, who could not climb, but who got beneath the loft edge and braced himself and made of his own broad back a step and shouted up to the boy to jump, jump, I have you. And Jasper jumped, down through the smoke, and Levi took the whole weight of him, and they went down together onto the burning floor, and Maren had them both by the collars hauling toward the air, and then Elias was there, and Garrett, and they dragged them out. All of them, out into the cold and the dark, and the wet frost grass, just as the loft came down behind them in a roar of sparks. They lay in the grass, coughing, black with smoke, alive, and Elias Hartwell pulled his son against his chest and held him. This man who let nothing show, and he made a sound into the boy's hair that Maren would never repeat to anyone. The sound of a man who has just come within 10 feet of losing the last thing he had left. And Jasper, the guarded boy, the boy who gave nothing, clung to his father and wept, and then he reached out one black small hand, and he took hold of Maren's sleeve. And he did not let go. The barn burned to the ground. The horses lived. The people lived, and as the gray dawn came up over the smoking ruin, Levi Hartwell did something that changed everything. He had been walking the edges of the burn, slow, on the bad leg, reading the ground the way he read everything, while the others tended the children and the shaking horses. And Marin watched him stop. At the upwind corner of where the barn had stood, she watched him crouch. She watched him go very, very still. She crossed to him. What she said. He did not look up. He was looking at the frozen mud at the corner of the ruin where the fire had not reached where the ground kept its record. Coal oil, he said. You can smell it under the smoke. Somebody soaked this corner. This fire didn't start. It was started. She had known. In her heart, she had known. But to hear it. And then Levi said the thing he had carried for 2 winters. He said it staring at the ground in the flat, quiet voice of a man finally setting down a stone, too heavy to hold 1 more day. There's a boot print here, he said. Heel worn down on the outside. Right boot. A man who walks heavy on the outside of his right foot. He swallowed. I saw that print once before, he said. In the snow. At the top of the high road. The morning I found Lenore's wagon at the bottom of the ravine. There was a print, like that up top, by where the trace was cut. The trace was cut. Marin, I saw it. I was 22, and I was out of my mind with grief, and Eli was destroyed, and I had no proof, and I told myself a boy doesn't know what he's looking at. So I buried it. 2 winters. I told nobody. He looked up at her then, and his quiet eyes were wet. It wasn't an accident, he said. Somebody cut the trace and ran her off the high road. And the same somebody just tried to burn my brother's children in their beds. Marin stood in the gray dawn with the smoke rising behind her and the cold all around, and the last piece settled into place with a terrible, quiet click. Lenore had been about to expose Thorne's forged paper, so Thorne had her killed and made it look like the mountain road taking a life, the way the mountain road sometimes did. And now Thorne wanted this same family's land, and the family would not bend. So he had moved from a card debt to a torch, and the next time it would not be a barn. She knew what she had to do. She had known maybe since the letter, but now she knew it all the way down. She turned, and she walked back to where Elias sat in the wet grass with his son in his arms and his face black with smoke and 10 years older than it had been at midnight. And she knelt down in front of him. And for the first time since the platform she reached out and she put her hand over his. Elias, she said, I have to show you something, and then I have to tell you something. And you're not going to want to hear either one. And she led him when the children were settled, and Garrett stood guard with the rifle she had learned to load back into the cabin. And she took down the chest, and she put Lenore's unfinished letter into his hands. He read it, in the gray light, his lips moving once over the words. And Marin watched a man learn 2 winters too late that his wife had not died because the mountain was cruel. She had died because she was brave, because she had found something, because she had been about to do the right thing. I did not make a sound. That was the worst of it. He just held the letter, and his big scarred hands shook the hands that did not shake, and a single line of wet ran down through the black soot on his face and fell off his jaw onto the paper. And then Marin did the last thing, the hardest thing, the thing she had not had the right to do until this exact moment. She looked up at the shelf above the kitchen window, at the small sewing basket with the wooden lid, the thing no one touched, the thing the whole house had agreed for 2 winters to leave alone. Elias, she said gently, as she had ever said anything, may I? He looked at the basket. He looked at it for a long time. The last untouched corner of the woman he had lost, and then he gave the smallest nod a man can give. She took it down. She wiped the thin, even line of dust from the lid with her thumb, and she opened it. On top, a half-done piece of mending, a child's shirt, Jasper's sized for a smaller boy. The needle still threaded where Lenore had set it down one ordinary day, meaning to come back to it. The breath went out of Elias at the sight of it, but Maren the seamstress did not stop, because the basket was too shallow inside for how deep it was out. Her hands had known 100 baskets, and this one was lying about its own depth. She had felt it the instant she lifted it. So she pressed the corners of the bottom, the way her own hands knew to do, and the false bottom lifted. And underneath, folded flat, were two things. A letter, finished and sealed ready for the post that never came, and a single page copied out in that fine, careful hand of a federal land patent, with a drawing of a seal beside it, and beside that a second drawing of the seal that was on Thorne's deeds. And even a child could see set side by side that they were not the same seal, that one of them was a forgery. Lenore had not just suspected, she had proof. She had copied it out and hidden it in the one place on this earth a grieving family would never look, would never disturb, would protect, without even knowing they were protecting it. She had hidden the truth in plain sight, on the highest shelf, behind a thing too sad to touch, and she had hidden it well enough to outlive her own murder by 2 winters, and to wait for a woman who knew how to read a seal, to climb a mountain and open a basket. Maren held the proof in her hands, and she understood finally and completely why she had been brought to this place. Not by Harlan Thorne, not by a baited letter and 11 spent dollars, by something else, by the long, patient way that justice sometimes has of arranging its own arrival. But she also understood the danger, because proof of a forged federal seal was not a thing for a crooked county sheriff. It was a federal matter, and the only law that could touch Harlan Thorne was the kind that came from outside the valley he owned. And as if the mountain itself had been listening that very afternoon, a rider came up the road. Not one of Thorne's. A stranger in a good coat with a tin star and a leather case of papers, and behind him, a second man, older, severe, the unmistakable bearing of a man used to being obeyed in a courtroom. A United States Marshal, Dunmore, and a circuit judge, Holloway. For one wild beat, Maren's heart leapt, because here was the outside law, the very thing they needed, arrived as if in answer to prayer. And then the marshal spoke, and her heart turned to ice. "Hartwell," he said not unkindly, "there's a land hearing called, day after tomorrow, in town. A Mr. Harlan Thorne has filed a claim of clouded title against this parcel. Says the patent's defective. Says the land reverts to him. The judge here rides the circuit, and the matter's on the docket, so we've come to give you notice. You'll want to bring whatever papers you've got." The judge said nothing. He only looked at the smoking ruin of the barn with a flat, unreadable eye and turned his horse. And Maren stood in the doorway with Lenore's proof hidden in her apron, and understood the trap with a clarity that took the breath out of her. Because the law had come, but Thorne had called it. Thorne had set the hearing, in Thorne's town, with Thorne's sheriff to keep the order, and Thorne's bought witnesses to swear whatever Thorne paid them to swear. He had figured out he could not burn the Hartwells off the mountain fast enough, So he was going to take the land the legal way, with a forged deed. In front of a circuit judge who knew nothing of this valley, and a marshal passing through, and a town too afraid of Harlan Thorne to say one true word. I thought his forgery was buried with the only woman who had ever found it. He did not know that a seamstress with a steady hand and a dead woman's proof was standing in a cabin doorway, watching him spring his own trap and beginning very quietly to plan exactly how to spring it back. 2 days. That was all they had. 2 days to take a single fragile page of proof copied out by a murdered woman into a courtroom owned body and soul by the man who had murdered her, and to get it in front of the one judge and the one marshal who answered to no one in that valley, before Thorne's hearing became Thorne's verdict, before the law he had summoned to steal the land was turned instead into the rope that hanged him. If the proof survived the 2 days, if they survived the 2 days, because Harlan Thorne had burned a barn to move this family 1 inch, and he did not yet know they had found the thing that could end him. But Hester Vance had been listening, and the net was very tight now, and the question that would carry them into the longest, hardest day any of them had ever faced was a simple one and a terrible one. What does a man like Harlan Thorne do when he finds out the dead woman left her proof behind? And who does he send for it? And how far is he willing to go now with the noose already, this close to his neck? And the first night, Harlan Thorne made his move. They had expected it. That was the only reason it did not work. Marin had sat the family down at the scrub table the evening the marshal rode away, and she had laid it out plain, the way she laid out everything. Thorne had set the hearing. Thorne would have heard by now, through Hester Vance, that the Ashby girl was clever and asking questions, and if Thorne had killed Lenore to bury the proof, then the one thing on this earth that could still hang him was the proof. So he would not wait for the hearing. He would come for the basket first, in the dark, the way he did everything. So they did not keep the proof in the house. Levi took it. The folded page and the sealed letter wrapped in oilcloth carried out on the bad leg into the dark to a place only. Levi knew, a hollow under a stone. 3 ridges off where the snow forgets nothing, but no man would ever think to look. He went out at dusk and came back near midnight, and he said it was done, and he said nothing else because Levi never did. And in the house they waited. They came in the smallest hours. 3 men, not Mercer, quieter than Mercer. They came up through the pines on foot with their horses left below, and they came into the dark cabin through the kitchen window where the basket sat on the high shelf, and the first man got 1 leg over the sill before Garrett Hartwell put the cold mouth of a rifle against his ear and said in the dark in a voice with no grin left in it at all, "Evening." It was over fast, because 3 men breaking into a house in the dark have all the courage of the dark and none at all when the lamp comes up and there are 3 mountain men and a loaded rifle and a woman standing very still by the stove with a fireplace poker held like she knew how to use it, which she did. Garrett had taught her. They took the basket, the men said. They had come for the basket on the high shelf. That was the order. Get the sewing basket and bring it down the mountain and ask no questions. So Garrett let them take it. He let them. He handed it down off the shelf himself and put it in their shaking hands, the half-done shirt and the threaded needle, still inside the false bottom, empty, now its secret already carried off to a safer place. And he walked them to the door at the end of his rifle and he said, "Give Mr. Thorne our regards, and tell him the Hartwells will see him at the hearing." And the men went down the mountain in the dark, carrying an empty basket, carrying nothing, carrying a dead woman's mending, and not one thread of her proof. Maren stood in the lamplight after the door closed, shaking the poker still in her hand, and Elias came and stood in front of her and looked down at her, and there was something in his face she had not seen there before. Not gratitude, bigger than gratitude. You knew he'd come, Elias said. I know how a man like him thinks, she said. He had to bury it once. He'll always think the burying is the dangerous part. He doesn't understand that the dangerous part is the woman who keeps reading after the lights go out. Elias looked at her a long moment. Lenore would have liked you, he said. And then he turned away fast because he was a man who kept things behind his eyes, and that had been more than he meant to let up. But Maren stood there in the dark with her heart going hard, and she thought against every wall she had ever built. Oh no, because that was the moment she stopped being afraid of the trust. That was the moment she knew, and knowing was so much more frightening than the fire had been. The next morning, the morning before the hearing, a different rider came up the road, alone, and the whole yard tensed until they saw who it was. It was Effie, the thin woman from the boarding house steps. She came up the mountain on a borrowed mule with her whole life in a flour sack tied behind her, and she half fell off the animal in the yard, and Maren ran to her and caught her, and Effie clung to her arms, and the words came out of her in a flood, fast shaking the words of a woman who has finally decided to stop scrubbing the steps. I ran, Effie said. I heard them talking, Thorne and the sheriff, in the parlor. They didn't know I was in the hall. He's going to swear at the hearing that your patent's a forgery. He's got 2 men paid to say they saw the seal was wrong. He's got the sheriff to lose any paper you bring. And he laughed, and said the dead can't testify and the living are bought. And I thought of you, on the platform, how you didn't fall down. And I thought if she didn't fall down, then I don't have to scrub these steps until I die. She gripped Maren harder. And there's more, Effie said. There's a girl, came in last month, another one. Younger than me, younger than you. He sent for her the same way. The letters, the fare, the wife that never happens. She's in the back room right now, and she owes him $80 already, and she cries at night, and I couldn't leave her, but I couldn't help her, and I couldn't stay one more day in that house, so I ran, and I'm sorry, and please tell me you have something. Tell me he isn't going to win. And Maren held her this woman she had passed on a platform, and not been able to save this living proof of everything Thorne was, and she felt the last of her fear burn off and turn into something hard and clear and steady. She thought of the $11. She thought of the baited letters in a fine, careful hand. She thought of every charity matron with a prepared voice who had measured her and found her small. And she thought, no, not this time. This time the measure is going to be the truth. I have something, Maren said. I have exactly the thing he thinks died on that road. And tomorrow he's going to find out the dead can testify after all. Through the living, through us. And she sat Effie down by the stove with coffee, and she sent Levi back down the dark trail to bring up the proof from under the stone. And that night, the last night, she sat at the table with a lamp and a clean sheet of paper, and she did the one thing she could do that not one of those bought men in town could do. She read, and she wrote. She drew out both seals herself, the true one and the false one, large and clear, so that a judge with old eyes in a crowded room could see across 10 feet exactly what Lenore had seen. She wrote out the dates. She matched the figures from the ledger to the deeds. She built line by careful line in a seamstress's patient hand, a thing that no amount of Thorne's money could unweave. She built the truth so plain that a child could hold it up and read it. And Elias sat across the lamp from her late, into that night not helping because he could not but there, watching her work, the way he had watched her make a broth out of nothing on the first night. And near the end he said low, the most words he had given her at once. "I offered you a temporary place," he said, "room and board, until you sorted what came next. Do you remember?" "I remember," she said. She did not stop writing. "I did that," he said, "because I told myself I could never." He stopped, started again. "After Lenore, I told myself a man only gets the one, that wanting more than that was. He searched for it, greedy, or a betrayal of her. So I built a life that needed no one, and I was good at it. I was so good at it." Maren set down her pen. "And then you crossed a street," she said. "And then I crossed a street," he said. "And I told myself it was for the children. It was easier to say it was for the children." He looked at her across the lamp. "It was not only for the children," he said, and that was all. He did not reach for her. He did not dress it up. He was too plain a man for that, and she would not have believed him if he had. He just said the true thing once across a lamp, the night before the hardest day, and then he went to check the horses, and she sat there with her pen down, and her heart going, and a feeling in her chest. She had no practice at all in feeling. Hope. The expensive kind. The kind a poor woman pays for and pays for. She picked her pen back up, and she finished building the truth, because tomorrow she was going to need it. The morning of the hearing, the whole valley came down to town. They came because they always came for a hanging or a hearing, or any day the powerful might be made to answer, or the weak might be made to break. The street was full. The courthouse, a plain wooden room with a flag and a rail and rows of hard benches, was packed wall to wall and breathing. Harlan Thorne sat at the front in a good black coat with his lawyer and his sheriff and his stack of papers and the calm of a man who has bought everything in the room, including the outcome. He had two men on a bench behind him, rough men in clean shirts, the paid witnesses. And along the wall stood the sheriff's deputies, Thorne's deputies, watching the doors. The Hartwells came in together, all of them. Elias and Garrett and Levi and the children left safe up the mountain with a neighbor woman, and Maren between the brothers with that worn leather folder held flat against her chest, the way she had once held her whole life in a single bag on a railway platform. And Thorne saw her come in, and he smiled, because she was to him a small thing, a girl off a platform, a bride nobody wanted. He had heard she was clever, and he did not believe. Clever could stand against Bort. His men had brought him an empty basket in the dark, a dead woman's mending and nothing more, and he had taken that for proof that there had never been anything to find. He had buried the danger twice, once in a ravine, and once in a basket carried down a mountain. And he believed the way men like him always believe that what they have buried stays buried. Judge Holloway took the bench. Old, severe, a circuit judge who had seen every kind of liar in every kind of town and trusted none of them on sight. Marshal Dunmore stood by the wall with the tin star and the flat, patient eyes of a man who answered to Washington and not to Harlan Thorne. The judge called the matter. Thorne's lawyer stood and spoke smooth and sure. The patent on the Hartwell parcel, he said, was defective. The federal seal upon it did not match the lawful seal. Therefore the title was clouded. Therefore the land reverted, and Mr. Thorne, holding the senior valid claim, was the rightful owner. He called his two witnesses. The rough men in clean shirts stood one after the other, and swore they had seen the Hartwell deed, and the seal was false, and they would know a false seal anywhere. It was smooth. It was practiced. It was a noose dressed up as a law. And then the judge looked at the Hartwells over his spectacles and asked in the dry voice of a man expecting nothing whether the respondents had anything to say. And Elias Hartwell stood up, and he said 4 words that turned every head in that packed hot room. "She speaks for us." A murmur ran through the benches, because women did not speak in that room. Women sat on the benches, and women waited outside, and women did not stand at the rail in a federal land matter and address a circuit judge. Thorne's lawyer was already half on his feet to object, but Judge Holloway, old and severe and tired of liars, held up one hand, and he looked at the small, straight woman with the leather folder, and something in her stillness, something he had learned over 30 years on the bench to recognize, made him curious. "Let her speak," he said, and Marin Ashby walked to the rail. Her hands did not shake. I want you to see that. The girl who had stood on a platform and not fallen down, she set her folder on the rail, and she opened it, and she did not raise her voice. Because the truth does not need a raised voice, it only needs to be heard. "Your Honor," she said, "the seal on the Hartwell patent is genuine. I can show you the lawful federal seal, and I can show you the seal Mr. Thorne uses on his own deeds, and when you set them side by side, you will see which one is the forgery, and it is not ours." She laid the 2 drawings on the rail, large, clear, drawn by lamplight by a steady hand, and the judge leaned forward, and the marshal pushed off the wall and came to look, and the room went very quiet. Thorne's lawyer objected, loudly. These were drawings, he said, drawings by an interested party. Where was the original? Where was any document of authority? A woman's sketches proved nothing, and here was the trap inside the trap, because Marin had known he would say exactly that. "You're right," she said, turning to the lawyer, calm as still water. "A drawing proves nothing, so let me give you the original." And she took from the folder the page Lenore had hidden, the federal patent copied in a careful hand with the true seal, and beneath it she laid the sealed letter addressed to the Territorial Land Office in Helena in that same hand. "This was written," she said, "by Lenore Hartwell, the first Mrs. Hartwell. 2 winters ago, she discovered that Mr. Thorne was perfecting his claims across this entire valley with forged federal seals. She copied out the proof. She wrote to Helena to report it, and before she could send the letter—" Marin paused, and she looked for the first time directly at Harlan Thorne. Before she could send the letter, she said her wagon went off the high road, and the town called it an accident. The room did not breathe. Thorne's smile was gone now, the first crack in it, because this was not in his plan. The proof was supposed to be buried. The proof was supposed to be in an empty basket. He looked fast at his sheriff, and the look gave him away to every soul in the room, and Levi Hartwell stood up. "I found her wagon," Levi said. His voice was quiet, and it carried to every corner. "I was the one who climbed down to her, and I saw at the top where the trace had been cut clean through with a blade, and I saw a boot print in the snow, a right boot worn down hard on the outside edge." He turned, and he pointed, not at Thorne, at the sheriff. "That print," Levi said, I have looked at that man's boots for 2 winters and told myself I was wrong. I am not wrong. He cut the trace. On that man's order. The sheriff came up off the wall with his hand going to his gun, and the whole room surged, and Garrett moved to put himself in front of Marin. And for one breath, the courthouse hung on the edge of blood. And Marshal Dunmore drew first and stepped into the center of the room, and his voice cracked across it like a whip. Nobody, he said, moves. And nobody did. Because this was the thing Harlan Thorne had never understood the thing. His whole empire of bought sheriffs and paid witnesses and crooked deeds had never accounted for. He had bought the valley. But the man with the tin star had ridden in from outside the valley, and there was not enough money in Cold Hollow to buy a United States Marshal who had just watched a guilty man reach for his gun. Dunmore took the page and the letter and the drawings from the rail. He looked at the 2 seals side by side for a long moment, and then he looked at Judge Holloway, and the judge looked at the seals, and the judge looked at Harlan Thorne. And 30 years of reading liars settled at last into certainty. This hearing Judge Holloway said, his dry voice now hard as iron, is concerning forgery of a federal instrument, which is a federal crime. And the testimony I have just heard concerns the murder of Lenore Hartwell, which I am referring this hour to the United States authorities. He brought down his hand flat on the bench. Not a gavel, just his open hand, but it sounded like a door closing. Marshal, he said, take Mr. Thorne and his sheriff into custody. And it was done. It did not take an army. It took a dead woman's careful hand, and a young brother's 2 winters of silence, finally broken, and a marshal who could not be bought, and a seamstress who never once stopped reading after the lights went out. Thorne came up out of his seat with his face gone white and old all at once, the powerful man made small in front of the whole valley that had feared him, and he found when he looked around that room for one friendly face that there was not one. The town had feared him. The town had never loved him. And a town that only fears you will turn on you the instant the marshal's hand is on your collar. But there was one more thing, one more loose thread, and it walked in the door. Hollis Mercer, late, smug. Pushing into the back of the packed room, not yet knowing what had happened in it, carrying his gray coat and his oiled confidence and his folded paper, the bogus contract come to claim at last in front of the law the woman he believed was owed. He got 3 steps in before he felt the room, the silence of it, the way every face had turned. He saw Thorne in the marshal's grip. He saw the sheriff in irons, and he stopped dead, the paper, still in his hand, the blood draining out of his smooth face. And Marin Ashby turned from the rail and looked at him. She did not need to do anything. The law would have him now, the same as the rest. But Elias Hartwell crossed that room, slow, unhurried the way he moved toward anything that mattered. And he stood in front of Hollis Mercer, this big quiet man, and he reached into his own coat, and he took out a fold of money, 2 years of savings, the slow, patient money. A man sets aside to buy back a proper place in the world after he has lost everything, the money for the future, the money he had been guarding under a floorboard for 2 winters. And he pressed it into Hollis Mercer's hand. And he closed Mercer's shaking fingers around it, and he said in a voice flat and final, and meant for the whole room to hear, "That settles the fare, the board, and every lie you rode in here with." He leaned in. "It does not buy her," Elias said. "Hear me. Nothing buys her. It frees her from you, and from him. And from all of it." And he stepped back. "Now," Elias said, Go. And there it was, the picture from the very beginning. The courthouse and the cold winter light, and a tall man in a carpenter's coat pressing 2 years of his life into a smaller man's hand. Except now you know what it cost him. And now you know it was never the money that freed her. The money only freed her from the lie. What freed her was the truth she had carried to that rail in her own two steady hands. Hollis. Mercer dropped the money on the courthouse floor and fled, and the marshal's deputies took Harlan Thorne and his sheriff out through the crowd that parted for them, and did not say one word in their defense, and the great fear that had sat on that valley for 6 years walked out the door in irons into the cold, and in the days that came after the truth, finished its slow work. The federal men came up from Helena. Thorne's forged claims were thrown out, every one, in the valley parcels he had stolen. With crooked paper went back slow through the proper courts to the families he had cheated. Effie's debt was found for what it was, a fraud, and erased, and the younger girl in the back room of the boarding house was freed of her $80 and put on a coach home with her fare paid out of Thorne's seized accounts, and a dozen women up and down that country who had owed Harlan Thorne for the crime of being alone in the world found one morning that they owed him nothing and never really had. Garrett's debt died with the man who held it. But Garrett did not let it go easy on himself. He stood in front of his brothers, and he owned it, the whole shameful weight of it, the cards and the lies, and the night he had nearly let himself be turned into Thorne's hand against his own family. And Elias did not give him grace cheap, but he gave it, and Garrett went to work that spring rebuilding the barn board by board with his own hands, paying a debt that no longer had a holder, paying it to himself, which is the only debt a man like that can ever really settle. And Levi set down the stone he had carried for 2 winters. He had buried his brother's wife, and buried the truth with her, and called himself a coward every day since, for not speaking, and now it was spoken, and it had brought down a murderer. And the quiet youngest brother walked a little easier that spring, even on the bad leg, because a man who finally tells the truth he has been swallowing finds he can breathe again. The barn rose new against the pines. The mountain greened. The frost let go. And one evening in the early warm, Elias Hartwell found Maren on the porch on the step that Levi had fixed her first week there, the step that had been loose and was now solid under them both. The valley was gold below them. The children were inside Hattie, singing some small tuneless song, Jasper of all things helping her with her letters, the tail of the G going under the line like a hook. Elias stood a while and said nothing, the way he always let the important things gather before he spoke them. And then he said it. "I'd like you to stay," he said, "as my wife, if that's what you want." He did not dress it up. He did not get down on a knee or make a speech. He was too plain a man, and she would not have believed him if he had. He just said the true thing, the way he had said the true thing across a lamp, the way he had said her name in a courtroom. And Maren Ashby, who had come west on $11 and a baited letter, who had been left on a platform in front of a whole town, who had been measured her whole life by people who needed her to be small. Maren took the space that choosing for herself required, and nobody hurried her, and the Gold Valley waited. Yes, she said, quietly, completely, with nothing held back. That's what I want. And he let out a long, slow breath, the breath of a man who had built a life to need no one and had just been set free of it. And his big scarred hand found hers on the solid step in the gold light. And that was all, no more than that. The first warm evening of a life that was at last chosen. They were married that summer, simply in the meadow with the pines standing witness, and the children threw wild flowers, and Effie cried, and Garrett gave a toast that went on far too long, and Levi stood up at the back where he liked to stand and smiled where no one could see him do it, which was how Levi smiled. And the seasons turned the way they do. Years later, if you had climbed that road, you would have found a place that thrived. A new barn and a full pen and a porch where nothing sagged. You would have found Jasper grown tall and steady working wood beside his father, the hard-guarded boy, gentled into a good young man who still kept his own counsel, but no longer kept his heart behind a wall. You would have found Hattie, not so little anymore, who had never once in all those years called Marin anything but Mama, and who could not remember a time before her, and did not try to. And inside on the shelf above the kitchen window, you would still have found a small sewing basket with a wooden lid. But it was not dusty now, and no one was afraid of it now, because Marin had taken it down that first spring, and she had finished the half-done shirt, the one Lenore had set aside with the needle still threaded, meaning to come back to it. She had finished it for the boy it was meant for, who had outgrown it, so she had let it out and given it to a smaller cousin, and then she had filled the basket with her own work, and Hattie's first clumsy stitches, and a life that went on. The dead woman's basket had become a living woman's basket. The grief had become the thread, and the thread went on. Lenore Hartwell had been brave enough to find the truth and to hide it where it would wait, and it had waited. For a seamstress with a steady hand to climb a mountain and open a lid and read what the world had tried to bury. One woman's courage kept safe across 2 cold winters in a basket on a high shelf until another woman came to carry it the rest of the way home. The kitchen held its warmth in the evenings. There was often something on the stove with a little molasses in it, because Elias had a sweet tooth he would never admit to, and Marin pretended not to know, and added a little more. And sometimes on a winter night with the children asleep and the fire low, Elias would look across at the woman. The whole town had once thrown away the woman who had not fallen down on a platform, and had not run from a fire, and had not flinched at a rail in front of a circuit judge, and he would think of the cold Wednesday he had stepped out of a hardware store and crossed a street without deciding to. And he would think that some things you do not plan. Some things just walk into your life on a single bag and a straight back and stay and become the whole of everything that matters. And that was the story of Marin, a woman who arrived with nothing but a bag and a spine, and who left in the end with everything: a name, a home, 2 children who were hers in every way that a heart can make a child its own, and a man who learned because of her that the dead are honored, not by the living staying frozen, but by the living daring to love again. She had been told she was no one. On a platform, in front of a whole town, she turned out to be the one who set the whole valley free.